Our next keynote speaker is Dr. Nancy Wolff, who's an economist and professor. She's the director of the Blaustein Centre for Survey Research and former director of the Centre for Behavioural Health Services and Criminal Justice Research, and that's at Rutgers University. Since 1995, she's increasingly focused on public policies and justice practices that influence the incarceration and rehabilitation of justice-involved people. She also has a UK connection because in 1999 she was awarded an Atlantic Public Policy Fellowship to study the management of mentally disordered offenders in the United Kingdom. Her research explores the need for behavioural health services among justice-involved individuals, treatment interventions that are responsive to those needs, and the role of environmental conditions and training in improving the effectiveness of treatment interventions provided in those settings. She also provides training on trauma, mental illness, motivational interviewing, and she does that to many people, including law enforcement and correctional staff. Dr. Wolff also spends 2 days a week in prisons in Pennsylvania and New Jersey, teaching, leading, reading, mindfulness groups, and working with residents to build coping skills. So please welcome Dr. Nancy Wolff.
Well, thank you very much, Mike, for that introduction. I appreciate it very much, and I'm delighted to be here and to see you all today. Thank you very much, Anne, for inviting me and giving me this opportunity to talk about the person-first approach. And also, I'm so grateful to see all of you this morning, given what I heard about last night and the dancing until 1. I do have some good news. What happens in Montreal stays in Montreal, so any of you who are concerned about that can rest assured everything is okay. So again, I'm just so delighted to be here, and I'm giving a very non-traditional talk, a talk I've never organized in this way before, so I'm asking you to have mercy on me and to give me a little space to be non-traditional in how I'm going to approach talking about how I do my research. So I'm going to start out at the beginning, or very close to the beginning of my career, when I submitted a manuscript to the journal Psychiatric Services, and I received a consciousness-changing comment from the editor. And that comment was, "It is person first." And that was in response to my use of the term, I used the term mentally ill, the mentally ill, to respond to or to refer to people who had mental illness. That comment was truly life-changing for me because since that time I have done my best to see the person first and always. It has informed my research, and most importantly, it has guided how I do my research and how I conduct myself while doing research. The person-first approach is not about just language. It is about seeing the person and saying yes to that person in ways that make them feel seen, heard, safe, and that they can trust. It's about saying that you matter. So that is the approach that I'm going to be talking about today, that person-first approach. And I was walking around my local bookstore, and I went into the business section, and I was very surprised to see some of the top-selling books were also embracing the person-first approach. And now I want to remind you again, I was in the business section of the bookstore. So I saw titles like Rehumanizing Your Business, The Soft Edge, Reclaiming Conversation, The Power of Talk. And I thought, well, this is interesting because all these books have in common that they're saying the importance of the human relationship. These authors and many other like them were saying that in the digital age, we have moved too far away from the soft edge, the approach of highlighting trust and rapport and warmth and personal engagement. And those are the factors that these authors were arguing is contributing to success and satisfaction. So I thought that was very interesting because the systems that we work in, forensic, behavioral health corrections, criminal justice, the academy, have in recent years been heavily influenced by the traditional business model. That business model is one that is more likely to emphasize those hard-edge metrics. And those metrics are, hard-edge metrics are more efficiency. As an economist, we always say we want more and more and more from less and less and less, and many of us feel that on a day-to-day basis. Also, the reliance on predictive analytics and risk management, risk assessment, that narrows in a sort of dissociated way to a small set of characteristics, and also speed, quick, fast fixes. And all of those tend to de-emphasize and crowd out the more soft-edge approach of the person-first approach, which is presence, civility, comity, listening, and choice. And those are the factors that I'm going to be talking about. And it is my contention in my talk that the person-first approach is cost-effective, that it adds very, very little to the budget. It is universal, everyone can do it. And also that it's effective because it builds positive connections to each other that are the centerpiece of treatment, receptivity, and engagement and effectiveness. So I am going to draw on a randomized control trial that I fielded in a maximum security male facility about 5 years ago. This particular study involved screening men for trauma, for PTSD, for addiction disorders. And those that screened positive were then randomly assigned to 2 different manualized integrated treatment for addiction and trauma. These were group programs. And I'm going to make my point by deconstructing that implementation using another very, very powerful way of communicating, and that's storytelling. So I am going to draw on a 15th century poem that has been storyized, and it features King Arthur and the Round Table. And this particular poem or story has several names, but the one that is I'm going to use is What Do Women Want? And I know all the women are saying, okay, wow, this is good. I'm going to tell the story in its gendered version, and then I'm going to generalize it to what do people want as I try to make the case for the person-first approach. Now, before I do that, I want to, as I start to tremble just a little bit, to let you know that I am not a Garrison Keillor prototype. So I'm not a professional storyteller, for those of you that watch Prairie Home Companion or listen to Prairie Home Companion. And also, this is a very non-traditional approach for me. So please just suspend judgment. So just so that you all, it's just a way to kind of build empathy for me. I'm using my person-first approach right now. Please have empathy for me being up here having to tell a story. This is a 15th century poem, What Do Women Want? I have the main characters here, so in case you kind of get confused what I'm talking about, you'll know who they are. So where's King Arthur? Okay, so King Arthur is hunting in Inglewood Forest, and he sees a white stag. And he pursues it, he stalks it, and he eventually kills it. So what King Arthur does not know is that in the stalking, he actually trespassed onto another knight's property, Sir Gromer. Now, Sir Gromer has great enmity for King Arthur, and he has been looking for opportunities to harm him. And by convention of property and ownership rights in medieval times, when a trespasser goes onto your property and kills something, you have right to kill that person. So Sir Gromer thinks this has worked out well for him because he could kill King Arthur for this transgression. But he also knows that if he did that he would be scorned and shunned by the other knights. So he has another plan in mind. So he rides up to King Arthur, who is looking over his kill, and says to him, you and I both know that I could kill you right now for what you have done, but I'm going to give you an opportunity for redemption. So King Arthur says, okay, what's the plan? And Sir Gromer says, you have to provide an answer to a question. And I'm going to show that I'm fair-minded, in that you will have to, I will give you a year to find the right answer. I will give you 3 chances to answer that question. And also there's a condition of secrecy that you are not allowed to share this arrangement. So King Arthur says, well, sure, okay, what's the question? And Sir Gromer says, the question is, what do women want? So he says, I'll see you in a year, come back with the right answer, and then we'll see if you die or you live. So he returns to his hunting party, heavy demeanor, obviously, and later that night he confides in Sir Gawain, a knight of the Round Table, who is also his nephew, that he had this unfortunate encounter with Sir Gromer and that he is under a death penalty. So Sir Gawain is very optimistic, says, no problem, king. What we're going to do is go to the 4 corners of the kingdom, and we're going to ask every man and woman, what do women want? We'll come back in 11 months, we'll look at our data, we'll select the 3 best, and we will save your life. So that's what they do. So 11 months back, they come together and they're looking over their data like we do and saying, oh, well, what are the findings? And so they try to find the 3 best, and you know that feeling as a researcher when you're looking at this and say, just doesn't feel right. And so King Arthur says, I just don't feel we have the right answer. So he decides to leave the castle and mount his horse and go for a ride in Inglewood Forest to see if he can't get some inspiration. And while he's riding, he hears the most beautiful melodic voice he has ever heard. And the voice says, I know the answer to the question. So he looks around and he doesn't see anybody. And it's now, those of you who are forensic psychologists and psychiatrists are starting to think maybe he's psychotic. So he stops his horse and he hears distinctly the voice say, I know the answer to the question. Now, in the foreground, he sees an abandoned cottage. So he decides to dismount and go towards the cottage, goes around the edge, and when he turns around to the front of the cottage, he sees, cowered in the corner, the most hideous creature he has ever seen in his life. Bulbous, warted nose, oozing eyes, broken teeth, hair with insects, and he swears he sees 2 eyes pointing out at him. So he's really very concerned. But out of this creature comes that beautiful voice saying, I know the answer. And he says, okay, well, I'm King Arthur, and maybe you could tell me the answer. And she says, I will tell you the answer if you promise to grant my wish. And he says, what is your wish? And she says, I want to marry Sir Gawain. Yeah, so he's thinking, all right, I can't promise that, but I'll go and ask him. He goes back. Sir Gawain says, I am loyal to my king. If this will save my king, I will marry this loathly lady. So he goes back, tells her, she gives him the answer. At the fated day, he returns to Sir Gromer and gives his first answer from the people. Sir Gromer says no. Gives the second answer, no. Got the third, death for him or the marriage for Sir Gawain to the lovely lady. So he goes with his own life. He says, okay, what women want is voice to be heard. Sir Gromer just yells and screams and says, next time you do this on my property, I'm going to kill you directly, because he had gotten the answer right. So King Arthur returns to the castle, tells the bad news, the good news and bad news to Sir Gawain, and goes back to the lovely lady and says, okay, listen, thank you for saving my life. I really appreciate it. Your answer was correct. I'm going to send a horse at dusk, and we're going to bring you into the castle. We're going to have this private marriage. And she goes, whoa, 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 whoa. It's not going to happen. She says, I am marrying the most trusted knight of the Round Table. I want to have an approach that reflects his stature. So I want you to send me a white steed in a nice dress. And I'm going to want to come in at the high noon. And I want all the king's people out there. So she approaches, and there's lots of fanfare and horns. As she approaches and people see her ugliness, there's a gasp and a silence as she approaches, and she just creates great silence and as she approaches the castle. There's the wedding and then the feast. And the lovely lady is looking to see if her husband is going to act nobly or ignobly in how he treats her. And she watches him, and they eventually retire to the marriage chamber. He's looking out the window, she's sitting down. She says to him, "Our marriage must be true. You must kiss me." So being dutiful, he bends over, he gives her a kiss, and she turns as beautiful as her voice. And she says, "I am Lady Ragnall, Sir Gromer's sister. He has put me under a curse. Marrying you has broken that curse, but I still will now be able to be beautiful during the day when all the subjects see me in public, but I will be my hideous self at night when I am with you. Or I can be my beautiful self when I am alone with you at night, or I can be my ugly self, and I will be my ugly self when I'm out in public." And she says, "What do you want?" And he says to her, "Alas, my lady, it is not my choice to make, since you have to live the consequences." And with that, the curse is completely broken, and she becomes her beautiful self. So the moral of the story is that to bring out the best in people, you have to give them voice and be heard, but also the choice over the consequences of their own life. So how am I going to use this story to decompose this implementation of my study? Nice story, right? But how am I going to use that? So here's the challenge for me. Okay, so I'm going to break this story. Remember, we got the first person approach. And we know what that's all about in terms of the inputs into it. So I'm going to break this analysis of my implementation of my randomized control trial into 4 parts: the harm, the quest, the union, and the choice. So I'm going to start with the harm. And it's important to start here because remember, with my study, I'm at a maximum security prison, and my job is to ask people who have committed crimes, who've been convicted of crimes, to participate in my study. And it's always important to remember that there was harm that started this process, and that the harm was this white stag that was the initial victim that was killed on another's property. So we look at King Arthur, and King Arthur has committed a crime, but there was secrecy assigned to that. And he did not lose stature or title in the commission of his crime. This is what we oftentimes see with white-collar or crown crime. But for most people who commit crimes, they lose their privacy and they lose their person status. That it happens in stages. The first thing is that we will oftentimes attach stigmatizing labels to people who have committed crimes. We will call them criminals, we will call them offenders, we will call them felons. Next, when they are prosecuted and found guilty, we will oftentimes define them by their crimes, that they become murderers and rapists and sex offenders and arsonists and drug dealers. And then when they go to prison, they become a number, and that completes the dehumanizing process. I will draw a lot on the voices of the men to echo back what I'm saying, because again, part of the beauty is really allowing voice to be heard. So here's when the men talk to me about that experience. They say, "I don't like being referred to my cell number by my cell number of my DOC number. It makes me feel like I'm not human anymore. It's just like being a robot. The staff are being taught to dehumanize us. I'm used to being treated like a number, like an inconvenience, like nobody's trying to help. You're not in a room with all these murderers, these rapists. You are in a room just with people." And then talks about how the system is creating monsters of them. So I think that it's very clear how that dehumanizing sort of the myth of the criminal. But there's, Yuval Harari wrote the book Sapiens, A Brief History in Humankind, and he talks about the role of myth, storytelling, and social organization. He argues that throughout the millennia, we have used stories to create social order, that create social hierarchies that are based on imagined differences among people in terms of their color, in terms of their gender, in terms of their heritage, in terms of their religion, and that creates differences, and that those differences create hierarchies. And the people who are at the high end of the hierarchies get respect and inclusion, and those people who are at the low end of the hierarchies are individuals who get disdain and oftentimes disrespect or indifference, and they are also oftentimes excluded. And that's the myth of the criminal that is incorporated, the story that oftentimes is part of the institutional environment inside prison, and it's also what people who've committed crimes oftentimes experience when they do return to the community. There's also the harm of the cursed victim. The loathly lady was cursed by her brother and turned her ugly, so that she was socially isolated and abandoned. Many people who are incarcerated have also been abused by people that they knew. And this is an area that I've done research in for well over a decade. And I'm just going to go over some of the facts because I think it's so important so that I can develop another myth that's relevant. The trauma is prevalent among people who are incarcerated. Childhood trauma, well over half the people who are in prison have experienced some form of childhood trauma: physical, sexual, emotional abuse, neglect, abandonment. It's oftentimes either witnessed or directly experienced, multiple exposure, early onset. Also, a sizable minority of those individuals, when they go into prison, will also experience prison-based victimization. About the prevalence rates for a 6-month period suggest that about 36% of incarcerated people will experience physical abuse, and about 10% will experience sexual abuse in a 6-month period. The likelihood of experiencing that increases if you have a mental illness, if you have a substance abuse problem. And there are also gender differences that we observe. Now, yesterday in Dr. Tremblay's talk, he connected kind of this longitudinal approach and talking about how maternal experiences affect the aggressiveness of children. But we also have another major study, the ACEs study, which was a collaborative process between the CDC and Kaiser Permanente, that have been able to identify that adverse childhood experiences affect neurological or neurobiological and cognitive development, but it also increases the likelihood that those individuals will have poorer health and mental health outcomes. In particular, they have elevated risks of juvenile delinquency, of substance abuse, as well as incarceration. My research in the last 5 years has been saying, okay, well, I know those individuals are coming into prison. How does that impact their prison-based distress levels? And so we've been able to see that physical victimization in childhood and adulthood are predictive of criminal sentiments, aggression, substance abuse, hopelessness, depression. Same thing with sexual victimization. Abandonment is also predicting these adverse outcomes. Our most recent study with my colleague in Spain, Francisco Sanchez, we've actually been looking at ACEs and been able to replicate the major ACE finding of a graded relationship or a dose-response relationship of the more adverse childhood experiences that a person who's in prison has experienced, the greater the psychological distress that those individuals experience. Now, how we make sense out of that, how we make sense out of childhood experiences is an area that's gotten a significant amount of research. And we know that trauma experienced in childhood oftentimes shatters a sense of trust and safety, oftentimes creates problems with bonding with others, and also makes them hypersensitive to power hierarchies. And that also influences how they think about the world and themselves. And this is a great diagram that was from SAMHSA TIP publication, which I call the myth of the cursed, which is this cognitive triangle that says that people who have experienced childhood abuse oftentimes think the world is a dangerous place and people are not to be trusted, that they view themselves as being inadequate and flawed and oftentimes not deserving of good things. And also their views about the future is that it just doesn't matter, nothing good is ever going to happen to me. And this is, again, that internalization of the myth of the cursed. It was very, very important for me to go into my study knowing that these were two myths that were relevant to the population that I was going to try to approach. That there was the socialization of the myth of the criminal, but also that the individual had internalized the myth of the cursed. So going back to the second part, the quest of the cursed, the loathly lady very much wanted to have that curse broken, but she knew she needed help. Likewise, King Arthur knew that he was under a death penalty and he needed help. They had a mutual interest that brought them together, and it formed a bond of promise. We see the same thing with our sort of therapeutic, with the individuals that I had done work with previously, that I believed that those individuals wanted to be freed from their curse, from their abuse. And here are the words from the men substantiating, yes, I want to have that curse broken, looking for a way to get out from underneath the things that I know cause me problems. I'm motivated to stop having nightmares. I've always been trying to find something that works to keep me from making the mistakes I've made all my life, but also recognizing that they needed help, that they know that I need help. I want to find why I'm so angry. So I knew that that was possible, that part of the bond, but I also knew that I was in the King Arthur role, in that I had been given all this money to do this study and that I would fail if I was unable to connect. I would fail in being able to advance science and eliminate some ignorance around this problem. Also, as a clinician, I knew that I could fail in that this would also have the possibility of not being able to heal and just the perpetuation of suffering. So there was a bond of promise that I also had going into my study. Now, bonds of promise are latent, and they are very, very fragile. So how we approach them matters a great deal. King Arthur had to leave the comfort of his castle. He had to be open to finding a new answer. He had to be open to hearing that voice in the forest. He also had to dismount from his horse and had to level the social hierarchy. He also had to approach with goodwill and interest. Amy Cuddy, in her book Presence, calls that authentic presence, when we approach with warmth and competency. And we still have to prove our worthiness, and we also have to remember that those that we're approaching are still likely to distrust us. For me, I had already been working in prisons for about 10 years, so I knew me as a researcher approaching this new maximum security prison that there was going to be distrust of me by administration, by correctional staff, and the residents, but for different reasons. The residents saw me with distrust because they didn't want to be a guinea pig and they didn't want to be used for career advancement. So I knew my first contact was going to be burdened with skepticism at best and cynicism at worst. So my approach was to ask the administration if I can first meet with a group of thought leader residents, those are individuals who seem to have some authority or respect within the prison population, and that I would have a chance to meet with them, that they could ask me questions, that we could do a video together that would then be played on the prison channel. I also asked that I could directly recruit off the blocks. This particular prison had 4 blocks. Each was about 1/3 of a mile long, 2 tiers, 800 men per block. So I wanted to be able to go cell to cell from 10 o'clock in the morning to 11 o'clock at night on Saturday and Sunday. And that's what I did. to recruit. It was my effort to get close, to level the social hierarchy, and approach with warmth and confidence. To tell you what some of the men talked about this, and actually this is still a legend in the prison. You should, about seeing me on the block at 9 o'clock at night with my little backpack and going cell to cell. So here's what some of the men talked about. He said, for me, I looked up one evening, the professor was at my door. For some reason, we had a connection. I hesitated to come to the door, but when I did, she talked to me for a few minutes, and I just felt something genuine about it. I got the impression like whatever it was, she believed in it. I don't know what this woman is doing, but whatever it is, she cares, and she's going to make an effort. And when she showed up at my door and actually spoke to me like I was a human being and not just a commodity to be moved around and contained. Another said, I wasn't going to sign up, but after the 10th time I seen her around, I said, maybe I should sign up and see what this program is about because she's so persistent. They also talked about this sense of security and sincerity. And then this last one, it was the first time that I'd ever had somebody since I've been incarcerated talk to me instead of down at. And that was one of the things that really made me want to participate, to actually put in the work and open myself up and make myself vulnerable, so flattening that hierarchy. So I was able to establish this bond of trust, but that was me. But eventually they were going to have to meet my research staff, and they were going to have to also reinforce that. So here's a great quote from a man who went down. He says, when I first came down, I said, man, I ain't going to do this. And then I signed up. Then I went down there, and there was the nicest people you ever wanted to meet. So I came, and I did the computer, and I then got frustrated and said, I'm done with this. And one of the interns came, sat down next to me, and said, it's going to be all right. We'll get through this. And just helped me through it, and I felt real comfortable. So we were able to, my team, the research part of the team, we were able to establish this bond of trust. And the effectiveness of this was that we got 65% of the men that I invited agree to participate in the screening. So the next part of the story was the union, the public union. Now, there were 3 bonds of trust, right? King Arthur and the lovely lady, King Arthur and the Sir Gawain, and Sir Gawain and the lovely lady. And those bonds of trust to become unions required the adhesive to hold it together, to bond it. And that was the code of chivalry, to honor their words, to be honorable, to be noble, to be loyal, to be civil, to be respectful. It caused those bonds to become unions. And we have a similar bond in a therapeutic sense. In a therapeutic union, the person who is cursed is asking to be accepted unequivocally and non-judgmentally as a partner in the healing. And this is what I think Dr. Tapswell was talking about not being other, but really being able to have that connection in that therapeutic union where there's a sense of we're working together as a partnership and there's not this social hierarchy. Again, it's important that we always remember that those hierarchies can actually get in the way of us being effective as clinicians. So we, as clinicians and researchers, have our own code of conduct, our own code of behavior. As clinicians, we do no harm. As researchers, we minimize risks. As clinicians and researchers, we honor privacy and confidentiality. As researchers and clinicians, we also act ethically, responsibly, and we are civil in our engagement. But it was the next phase of the study that had me nervous because I and my research team had created the bonds of promise, but we had to shift it over to the clinician group who was going to administer the interventions. And we knew that the men who had agreed were going to look at them with great scrutiny and say, are those clinicians going to be like the research team that are practicing authentic presence, or are they going to judge us as cursed and ugly? So they wanted to know, are those clinicians going to be present? Are those clinicians going to be trustworthy, safe, and will they be heard? And again, here are just some of the words again from the men. They felt that the therapists were genuine and true, that they genuinely cared about what was being said, that the therapist was opening her heart and that she believed what she said, that she was the same person every time she came in, so that importance of consistency. And I didn't feel like the therapist was above us, over us, but like us and relating to us. Again, can I trust you? And again, the men were saying that the therapist felt real, that she had a lot of things that we talked about. That's good to find a therapist, somebody that relates and not just all book learning, that helped me to trust her and realize that she does care and wants to help us get on the right path, that trust was built, that there was comfort, that, the therapist just didn't look at it as another inmate, another number, another fella, another this. We were actually people. So, am I safe with you, which was a big issue. Where was the therapist really there, and was she equipped? Was she a leader? She set the tone, she set the morale, set the program in motion. She gave everyone the same amount of time, that equity issue. It was a safe space where people felt like they could talk. One man says, when I walked in the door, I'd be able to hang my mask on the door and not have to pick it up until I go back out, because there's a higher level of trust in this room and a higher level of respect. Am I safe? Everyone talked about feeling safe in the room, that it was welcoming, it was non-judgmental, that the therapist made us feel like as a group, as one, and that she actually take the time to listen to you one-on-one. You wasn't treated like an inmate where you were just another face to fill a seat. Will you accept me? Another big question that's asked of clinicians in terms of making that person feel comfortable, that you managed to make the person feel as though what they were feeling was important. That the person was sincere and honest. And will you hear me? Will the person give my voice respect? Again, part of the story, which was to hear the person. What do people want to be heard? That I felt that it was comfortable, that the place was safe, that it was easy to feel comfortable and share amongst fellows and the therapist, that there was no dictatorship. It was a flow of feelings that made me feel comfortable. So that was the public union. We were able to create safe spaces where people were able to come there and feel like they could trust the clinician, and that trust then created this group cohesiveness. But then there was the private union. In the story, there was the tender act of acceptance, the kiss, when that act of full acceptance allowed the lowly lady to turn into Lady Ragnall. Now, I'm not encouraging all of us to be kissing the people that we're doing services to. That would obviously not be the right thing to do. But again, this is just an example. But there is a version of this in the therapeutic relationship that's important, which is this picture. It's the reunification of the parts of self, which Carl Jung says is one of the most important parts of human development, where the concealed and the unconcealed, where the incongruous and the congruous are joined together. In trauma therapy, we talk about that as the revealing of the trauma that is then integrated into the narrative identity in healthy ways. And so that was very important for the effectiveness of this treatment, that we would be able to see this unification. So again, looking to the words of the men, this is a very long piece, and I'm cognizant of time, so I'm going to go down to the later part of it, and this man says, it's weird how I feel, because that person then and the person now are two totally different people. I thought that person was scared and felt like he was less of a man if he became vulnerable and opened up, and now I realize that person became more of a man by doing this. Another person said, about 10 years ago in another facility on death row, I looked in the mirror for about 10, 15 minutes and just started crying. No particular reason. I just started crying, and I haven't had a mirror since. Since I took the group, I can look in the mirror and I found some peace. Let's see. Let me see if I want to read that one. No, I'm not going to read that one. I'm going to go to the next one. Another, will I accept me? So again, this private union is about the union that's taking place inside the person, not between the person and the therapist. I'm the same person, it's just that I'm now without the darkness that was walled up. I had the lock. The closet was locked with a latch on the inside. Well, now there's no latch on the inside anymore. Now it's wide open. I was like a bird that, with those broken wings, I couldn't fly or even foresee myself flying, but now I believe I can fly, you know. And so, again, we were able to see this kind of unification, and the person with whatever analogy or metaphor that they wanted to use to feel that they were becoming whole again, that whatever was broken in them was somehow being fixed. So, so I want to come to the part, the last part, which is sovereignty and choice, and what was, bless you, what happened, it's just reflex. What we know with sovereignty is that people want to have control over themselves. They want to have those choices. And in the exit interviews, I asked the men whether they thought that what I had done, these interventions, could be delivered by the Department of Corrections. And I got a very strong response to this, and it allowed me to see how they differentiated between mandatory programming and voluntary programming. So let's see their words again. And they said, here are the words about why they think mandatory programming is not good. It's very harmful. They said, people who did the program have respect for the material and have respect for other people's opinions and have respect for the results the program gives. If made mandatory, it would not benefit the people because they would be compelled or forced. You either want to take it or you don't. That's how you're going to benefit. It should be voluntary because when mandatory, they just go there to be there. They don't try to get anything out of it because it's being forced on them. The difference between a good group and a bad group is guys want to take it or have to take it. If it's mandatory, it's a problem with trust because now you have someone within the group who doesn't really want to be there, but that's when he'd be talking about you behind your back. So again, the violation of confidentiality and privacy in a group. I don't think it's conducive because if you want to change or if you really want help, it comes from within. You want that. Somebody else can't direct you or make you do that because you're not really wanting to change. So those were there was a very distinct sense that mandatory programming was not the way to go, but they did very much endorse the sense of voluntary. If it's voluntary, then the individual has the expectation of his own, of gaining his own mental well-being and becoming the better person. Knowing that you volunteered, you're here purely for the sake of your own well-being. When people volunteer, that means that they're actively searching and seeking for something and that they're most receptive to the potential for transformative benefits from the program. So it was very clear that they endorsed this notion that it was important to them that they got to make this voluntary choice to be in programs. And they did not want to be in programs that were mandatory because they felt like they couldn't take their masks off. They couldn't be authentic and get the benefits from the program. So we knew that part of the story was to bring out the best in the person is to give them choice, but also it brings out their beauty. And so a next question that I asked the men in the exit interview was, 3 months ago, I said to the men, you made this choice to participate in this program. What would you like to say to the man 3 months ago who made that decision to put you where you are today? And here are their words. He said, best decision that I've ever made because it helped me so much from who I am today and who I was at the beginning. I think it's one of the best decisions I've made since I've been incarcerated for 35 years because I benefited the fullest. Ecstatic about the decision I made. Finally made a good decision in my life. Did a wise thing. Took a healthy risk instead of an unhealthy risk. I feel proud. I feel good about myself. Nice going. I opened up. Change is good. Don't be so judgmental. Dare to be you. So I was so proud of the men and my team that we were able to create these bonds of promise and create these unions through how we conducted ourselves, and then also create these unions where we could see this self-affirming growth. Now we had at the end of the study, we had this major feast, and all the men, all the clinical staff, the research staff, the secretary from the Department of Corrections, the superintendent, many people at the prison, and we had a microphone, and the men were able to come up and talk about their experiences. And even in the large setting like that, some of them got really choked up when they were talking about it, talking about what they gained, how it changed them. And afterwards, so many of the staff who had known these men for 10, 15, 20, 30 years came up and said, I don't know what you did, but I've never seen him like that. And they were also willing to go public with their story. So when we look back, just to kind of make sure that you can see all the connections, because I think, again, going back to Harari's work in terms of the role of myth-making and storytelling that has created the social structures that we have. It was important for me when I was recruiting to remember the myth of the criminal and the loss of the person's status, and how important it was to make sure that I gave that back to the individual in their interactions with me and my staff. The curse of the harm and how that turns people ugly, and how they internalize that to be distrustful of others, themselves, and the future. In terms of the myth of the cursed and how that breeds distrust. The quest myth and healing is desired and requires help. The bond of promise, the hope through association. Authentic presence of being warm and competent at the same time. The code of conduct of professionalism and civility. The union, the therapeutic partnership, and the self-integration as the private union. And the sovereignty of self-affirming growth. In terms of us as professionals, we have a myth of choice. We can choose the myth of the criminal with risk assessment and probabilities and partitioning. Or we can be looking at the myth of the quest and the person in transition and help seeking and healing. And we may have those myths going on simultaneously. It's important, though, that we are conscious of those myths and how they directly or indirectly affect our behavior when we are doing our jobs. An area of research that I'm now working on is the willingness and ability to choose, because many people have the ability to choose, but they're not willing to choose. And trying to disentangle from some of the qualitative research is what makes people willing to make a choice. People who, who were invited in the study declined to participate in the study, but after the word got out and the first pioneering cohorts made it through, all of a sudden they wanted to come back. They said, no, I changed my mind. I really want to be in the study. And that risk aversion and how that willingness is influenced by the myth of the cursed. That safe space to engage, to be heard with interest and respect, and to be seen and treated as a person. So let me go back to that person-first approach. The person-first approach at its best has the possibility of taking latent and manifesting these bonds of promise and converting them through conduct into unions that can be transformative and self-affirming. That we do that through authentic presence, that's the process of being present with another individual, leveling those social hierarchies, of listening, of giving respect, of giving voice, allowing a person to say what they need to say without judgment. It also, I said that it was cost effective. So what I mean by that, and when I look at my own study, is first, it cost me very little to train my staff in the person-first approach. All I did was tell them the myth of the criminal, the myth of the cursed, and the myth the myth of the quest of the cursed, and that align ourselves with healing, not hurting, and then to model it. And it was much cheaper to do that than to train my research staff in administering the SCID, the CAP, and a 14-week manualized intervention. It was universal. It was easy. And yes, I said I modeled it, but what was so amazing to watch in the field was that my research and clinical staff got a contagion going. Because just like Dr. Tremblay said yesterday that Joan McCord said, you don't congregate people that all have the same problems in one area because it's going to be like the serve and return in child development. You're just mirroring that kind of behavior. But when we brought them into our culture, we saw the men start to act with authentic presence, that we got this contagion going. And then they went and infected the blocks, and we were changing the culture in the whole prison, that it did start to become a universal way of interacting. It was also effective. We got 65% of people who were asked to participate in the study to agree, and 70% of those who were eligible chose to participate. And those that chose not to, in the end, wanted to come back in, but we didn't have enough money to do another set of cohorts. So it was very clear that it was cost effective. And so what did the men say to us about the first person approach? It's about treating the human being like treating a human being. That's what it's about. You got to have people skills. And William Uray is not a resident of a prison. He is the co-founder of the Harvard program of negotiation. But I love his quote very much when he says, when you listen to someone, it's the most profound act of human respect. The last words on the first person is you all, and this is a comment on my research team, is you all see the humanity in this place, and that means a lot to us being behind these walls, that somebody on the outside actually says, you know what, those are human beings too, and they deserve just as much a chance as everybody else. As someone who has experienced the role of the loathly lady, King Arthur, as well as Sir Gawain, it's words like these that bring out the absolute best in me and give me life, and also make me eternally grateful for that editor decades ago who said to me, it is always person first. So thank you very much.